Hi there. Thank you for doing your holiday homework. Maybe you're doing it at the start of the holidays or the end. It doesn't really matter as long as this is done before your first lesson back in term 3. All right, let's get straight into it. So we're doing classical conditioning, and anytime you think about classical conditioning, I want you to think about the word association. So classical conditioning is learning through association. And a really easy example of that is, for instance, a dog, when you first get it, will get excited when you go for a walk. That's quite a natural response. So an unconditioned stimulus is going for a walk. The unconditioned response would be the dog getting excited. However, what you'll find is once you've taken your dog for a walk a couple of times, the dog will start to get excited when you go to its lead. And basically the dog has formed an association between the lead and going for a walk, and then eventually the dog will get excited whether you go to the lead or not without the walk. It's basically the lead that now causes the excitement. You can see the actual definition of classical conditioning on the screen there. Okay, famous experiment that you need to know about is Pavlov's experiment. In Pavlov's experiment, he got a dog, and what he noticed is before any learning took place, it didn't matter what dog he used, if he presented the dog with food, an unconditioned stimulus, the dog would salivate, and this is called an unconditioned response. And the word unconditioned means it's not learnt, hence it happens naturally. It's a reflexive response. He also noticed before learning that if you ring a bell in front of a dog, the dog generally has no response. So the bell was called a neutral stimulus because it produces no response. During learning, he found that if he paired the bell with food, the dog would still salivate, and that makes sense because the food's still there. However, what he didn't realise that is after doing this quite a few times, all he had to do in the end was ring the bell and the dog would salivate to the bell. And this becomes a conditioned response because it is not natural for a dog to salivate to a bell. So the conditioned stimulus is a bell and the learned response is to salivate towards that bell. You must know this experiment and we will go over it in class. Here are all the key terms in terms of neutral stimulus, unconditioned stimulus and what have you. I'm not going to read through all of these. I will use these terms as we go along throughout the term and also this PowerPoint. So just pause and write this down and it will start to make sense when you go back to it. Okay, second experiment that you definitely need to know about is Little Albert. And the Little Albert experiment was carried out by Watson and Rayner, and it's known for two reasons. First is that it was the first classical conditioning experiment done on a human instead of a dog like Pavlov. But the second is because it was quite an unethical experiment. They didn't get parental permission. Watson and Rayner simply worked in a hospital. There was a little boy called Little Albert, they didn't use his full name, who actually attended a childcare centre in the hospital, and they went and borrowed him from this childcare centre to be part of the research without his parents being aware. And what they did is they found with this little 11-month-old baby, if they showed a toy white rat, the baby had no response. What they also found before any learning took place is that if you strike a steel bar really loud with a hammer, what will happen is most 11 months old would cry or have a fear response, and that's quite natural, so a reflexive response. What Watson and Rayner tried to see if they could do was to see if little Albert could learn to be scared of something. So they paired the white rat that was originally neutral with the loud noise striking the bar, and of course because the striking the bar noise was there, the child was fearful. So that was what happened during learning, and they did this over several trials. After learning, what they found was all they had to do was present the toy rat, which is now called the conditioned stimulus, and that alone produced a fear response, which is now called the conditioned response. Okay? So you do need to know all of those steps in that particular experiment. But the other thing you need to know about it is why it's unethical. So the issue was that they did just take the child from the childcare facility. This meant the child had no informed consent from their parents, so no parental consent, and there's certainly no voluntary participation. parents did not have any choice as to whether they wanted their child to be part of the research. The other thing is, because the parents weren't aware, it also meant that the child had no withdrawal rights. It was an 11-month-old baby. He couldn't withdraw, but his parents also couldn't withdraw him from an experiment that they knew nothing about. When his parents did find out about the experiment, they literally took the child from the hospital that day, resigned from their jobs, and left the state. And this meant that there was no debriefing given. So for all we know, Watson and Ramona conditioned this little child to be quite scared of something, and perhaps that fear stayed with that child for a very long time. The only question I have to you is, if this did go to an ethics committee, would the ethics committee have approved it anyway? Would you expect that the ethical principle of beneficence was abided by? In other words, does what we got out of the experiment, learning that we can actually classically condition fear, does that outweigh the fact that we actually gave the poor little child a phobia? So that's a decision you can make, because beneficence is very much about an individual decision. Okay, so talking about phobias, this is usually how phobias are acquired, through classical conditioning. And the perfect example is, as a child, most children don't naturally have a response to a dog. They're not scared, they're not excited, they might be a little inquisitive. So a dog essentially is a neutral stimulus. However, for a child to become scared of a dog, generally what happens is the dog is associated with a bite. And of course, it's very natural that if a child is bitten, that they would feel fear towards that bite. Because they associate the dog with the bite, this means that after they've been bitten, they start to fear the dog. Okay, so the dog started off as a neutral stimulus, and eventually it ends up being quite a scared stimulus. In other words, we have a conditioned response to that particular stimulus. Now, we can get phobias through classical conditioning, which means we can also get rid of them through classical conditioning. So, for instance, if you are scared of dogs and you head off to a therapist, they might use graduated exposure, or its other name is systematic desensitization. It means the same thing, just some books call it something else. I like graduated exposure because it kind of explains what it is. Graduated step-by-step exposure to what you're scared about. So step 1 of graduated exposure is that you're taught relaxation procedures by your therapist. Step 2 is that you then break down your fear into a series of little steps. So for instance, if you're scared of a dog, the first step might be to look at a picture of a dog. The second step might be to be in the same room but be 20 metres away from the dog. The third step might be to be in the same room but be 10 metres away from the dog, and so on until you get to the point where you can actually approach the dog. And basically the person is exposed to each step very slowly, perhaps across numerous sessions, and they're taught to use these relaxation techniques while they're actually being exposed to those steps. And the idea is that basically you will break down the association, and the dog will basically produce a new association of relaxation as opposed to fear that it originally did. And the association between the bite and the fear generally is broken, because obviously you would get a dog that's not going to bite someone, and hopefully that would reduce their fear. There's another way of doing it, and that's called flooding. And flooding is a bit more full-on, so you can maybe remember F for flooding and F for full-on. And this means that there's no graduated steps. You're literally exposed to the most extreme version of your phobia. So if you're scared of dogs, flooding might involve being walked into, a pet boarding house that has 20 dogs, and having them all walk around you and run around you and jump on you. So basically you are then taught how to relax during that circumstance. So you would have your therapist with you who'd be getting you to breathe through it, and eventually the idea is that you can't continually be scared, and once you realise nothing is going to happen, that eventually over several hours you would start to relax. Obviously, this needs to be done in a very controlled environment, If you're scared of something, you shouldn't just go and use flooding yourself. A therapist would do this with you. Okay. The last thing that you need to know about classical conditioning is we can also use associations to basically get rid of unwanted behaviours by pairing them with an unpleasant event. So this is quite often used in people that smoke or drink. So for example, for someone who does drink, alcohol might not actually have any effect on them anymore. So it doesn't make them feel sick, it doesn't make them feel excited. Alcohol has just become a neutral stimulus. However, if you give them a chemical called antabuse, it's quite a severe chemical that once you ingest it, it would make you feel quite sick and make you feel quite almost hungover, so nauseous, dizzy, feeling quite horrible about yourself. What they do is every time you drink, you're required to take this particular medication. Or you just take this medication daily. So, and the minute you take alcohol alongside this medication, of course you're going to feel sick because of the medication. Eventually, the alcohol will be associated with the medication, and therefore, eventually, the alcohol will be associated with the hungover symptoms. So the alcohol becomes the conditioned stimulus, and this leads to the feeling of being hungover, which is the conditioned response. In the after conditioning section, can you just please make sure you write after the brackets conditioned response, not unconditioned response. So please get rid of the U in the after conditioning section. This can also be used, like I said, for smoking, for nail biting, and lots of other behaviours which we'll talk about in class. Alright, that's it in terms of classical conditioning. Hopefully we'll clarify a lot of this in week 1 of next term, and of course week 2 of next term is your first SAC. So hopefully you've got lots and lots of homework done. Okay, I'll catch you soon. Bye.